Now comes the most complex part of photography, which is metering. Now, metering is quite interesting, and that is actually the heart of photography based on which the exposure triangle parameters are decided. Now, be it Canon, Nikon or any camera model, the concept is again the same. Here what I am going to do, again I use the quick access button on my Canon camera and then come down and go into the metering. So, there you go. Now, metering, there are different kind of metering options. This is the entry level Canon 1200D, so where the spot metering is missing, but here we have evaluative metering, or in case of Nikon it is called as the matrix metering, or we also call it as the multi-segment metering. Then partial metering, same in Nikon as well, the center weighted average metering, and then this option, if you see, this is basically spot metering. Now, let us understand what each of these metering option does. Now, one step back, what is metering? The whole concept is, now if I am in aperture priority mode, okay, so I am basically at an aperture of, let's go down to say f4. So, for an ISO of 1600 at f4 in aperture priority mode, when I half press the shutter release button, I get a particular shutter speed. So, that value of shutter speed is decided by what kind of metering mode I am in. Now, in simple terms, for you all to understand, metering is nothing but it's more to do with the amount of light which is reflected from the subject. So, the camera calculates how much light is reflected from the subject, and to give you a very basic exposure, to give you a exposure where it's not very dark, where it is not very bright, it will give you the shutter speed of 1 by whatever. So, that is metering. Okay. So, based on various metering options, now when it comes to spot metering, what the camera does is, when it comes to your focusing point, you see this center focusing point, what happens is the camera, when you look through the viewfinder, wherever the center focusing point is aiming at, camera calculates the amount of light over there, how much light is getting reflected from that, and it will give you a decent exposure, not very bright, not very dark, okay, a medium exposure what we call, based on that amount of light being reflected from that center focusing point. Of course, there are options where you can move the focusing point and make sure you take the reading from there, but let's not get into that. So, in simple terms, in terms of spot metering, wherever the center focusing point is looking at, camera sees how much light is reflected, and then based on that it is going to give you a particular shutter speed. Now, this is where, if you look at that image, it will give you a decent medium exposure. Now, this is where your exposure compensation comes into picture. So, in my Canon camera I have the plus minus button, even in Nikon you have the plus minus button. Find out how to access the exposure compensation button in your particular model. I press it, and then the dial, if I move it around, there you go, it becomes darker or brighter. If I go into the quick access mode, into the exposure compensation, there you go, see there, I move it to the left, the image becomes darker. If I move it to the right, the image becomes brighter. At this point, auto exposure bracketing, keep it aside. So, darker or brighter. So, this is where, as a photographer, you have to decide. The camera will give a decent medium exposure. Looking at the scene, if you feel you need to cut down light, you can make it darker. You want to get in more light, you can make it brighter. So, that is about the exposure compensation metering using the center focusing point, which is the spot metering. Now, let us go into the other options of metering. Now, the other one is evaluative metering, or for Nikon guys it is the matrix metering or even multi-segment metering. So, in this case what happens, it does not take it from the center at all like spot metering. Okay. So, here it is the evaluative or matrix, that means, or the multi-segment, that means what the camera does is basically takes the average of the whole scene. So, it divides the entire segment. So, how much light is basically coming into the camera from the entire scene, not at that one single point. So, from the entire scene, how much light is coming into the camera, it will calculate, it will average it out, and then it will give you a medium exposure. Same again, use the exposure compensation to make it darker or brighter. That is evaluative. Next, the other metering is basically partial metering. The third one is partial metering. Partial metering is very similar to your spot metering, where again from the center focusing point what you have, So typically in spot metering, the center focusing point is an area of around 2 to 3% compared to your entire frame. Whereas partial metering, it takes a value about 12 to 13% of that focusing point at the center. That is about your partial metering. And then the last one is the center weighted average metering. So here what it does, it gives more emphasis to the center portion of the image, how much light is reflected from the center portion of the image, and then